Welcome and thank you for joining us for another online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd and I'm proud to be a board member here. I love the Historical Society, the staff, the volunteers, and the amazing artifacts and documents that they have, over 1 million items in storage here. What we're trying to do is to provide our members during this time of the pandemic some online programs to continue your study of history of the Adams County area. And tonight we'll present an interesting side of that story from John Winkleman. Our speaker tonight is a licensed battlefield guide here in Gettysburg. John is a Navy veteran. He served in Vietnam. He was in private industry and he has traveled the world. But his newfound passion is the taverns of Adams County. And I'm going to ask John to introduce himself by telling us how he got involved in this specialty of taverns. And I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Actually, it started out years ago during Remembrance Day parade. If you've ever been to Gettysburg on Remembrance Day, of course, you've got hundreds of reenactors in town. Happened to be sitting in O'Rourke's with a friend of mine, and of course, all the reenactors are in there, and they're about 4 deep at the bar. And I wondered what the taverns would have looked like in 1863 with all these soldiers in town. So my friend said, well, why don't you do a program on that? That would be pretty interesting. I said, I don't know. Well, apparently, before the parade, my friend was telling everybody I was going to do a tavern program. And by the end of the parade, everybody was coming up saying, when are you doing this program on taverns? I want to see it. So I said, all right, I'll do it. I'll go to the Adams County Historical Society. I will get the big book on taverns, pick out some stories, and voila, there's the program. So I got up to Adams County Historical Society, and I met Dr. Gladfelter, and he said, well, what are you trying to do? I said, well, I'm going to do a program on the Civil War taverns. I'm just looking for the big tavern book. And Dr. Gladfelter said, well, there is no big tavern book. We got lots of information, but it's scattered all over. You're going to have to try and put it together. And so we started working on the big taverns. We started going, the Civil War taverns, going through the license applications, newspaper clippings, deeds, damage claims, things like that. And finally got the program I wanted. I got it done. And then Dr. Gladfelter started getting involved in it too. So he said, well, do you want to keep going? So then we started, kind of expanding on it. Until today, we got quite a number of taverns done. Unfortunately, I haven't been doing much research in the last few years. I got kind of into some other things, but that's how I got started on this.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, we're going to turn now to the story of taverns, their history, and the part they played in the Civil War. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. My name is John Winkleman. I'm a licensed battlefield guide here at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But tonight what we're going to do is explore the historic taverns and inns of Adams County. Now today we call them bars, gin mills, watering holes. These are some of the names we apply to taverns today. However, in the 18th and 19th century, taverns enjoyed a much higher social standing. Indeed, with the westward expansion of settlers, the need for a tavern or an inn to provide food, drink, and lodging for travelers, as well as comfort for the local settlers, was second only to providing a place of worship. And as we'll see, many of the towns in Adams County grew up around a tavern. Taverns were considered so necessary that in 1656, the Massachusetts Colony Court, which granted tavern licenses, made the towns that did not have a tavern subject to a fine. Now, whether this was due to this measure or because the simple fact people liked taverns, taverns flourished. In 1675, the Reverend Cotton Mather complained that every other house in Boston is now an alehouse. New York wasn't far behind because by 1648, it was estimated 25% of the buildings in New York were taverns. And people must have liked to drink because in 1790, the Reverend John Black, right here in Adams County, tried to induce the Upper Marsh Creek Presbyterian congregation to embrace voluntarily a mild form of temperance. No abstinence, just moderation. It was reported that only 3 members of the congregation joined them. These early establishments went by various names: taverns, tavern stand, public house of entertainment, inn, grog shop, tippling house, and ordinary. The term ordinary is pretty much in just use by the late 1600s in the northern colonies, but it persisted in the South long after. So if you're reading about the Revolutionary War, you might come across Smith's Ordinary. Well, that means Smith's Tavern. After the Revolution, the term hotel started coming into use, as it was felt that the word inn was too English. Now, these early taverns and inns also served many other purposes for the surrounding communities. They would be used for political debates, polling centers for voting, property and land sales, post offices, courtrooms, jails, military enlistment centers. And if a tavern or inn had a large ballroom, even plays could be performed at the tavern. One historian even claimed that taverns were the nursery of the American Revolution, where the Sons of Liberty and patriots would meet to discuss the events of the day. Basically, all secular activities which were not considered proper for the church were held in the tavern. Now, because taverns and their proprietors were considered to be very influential, the royal government did not want any undesirable person to run one. All tavern keepers were required to have a license. The prospective tavern keeper would have to send an application for a license to the county court. Usually, a prospective tavern keeper was a well-respected member of the community, and he would also include on his application a statement signed by prominent members of the community attesting to his character. Once the court recommended the license the license would be sent to the royal governor. If approved by the royal governor, the keeper was required to post a bond. This bond would state the restrictions and responsibilities the keeper would be bound to by, such as not allowing drunkenness, based on the amount of alcohol they served in those days. That was probably very subjective. Unlawful gambling, no selling liquor to Indians, Negroes, servants, apprentices, and minors, and to truly observe the laws and orders regarding taverns and tavern keeping. Now, curiously, you only needed a license if you sold liquor by the small measure, which meant by the glass. If you sold it by the barrel or the keg, no license was required. Now, if you operated a tavern without a license, it was said you were operating a tippling house, and if you were discovered, you would be served a tippling indictment and fined. In some colonies, these fines would be that were collected actually went right into the royal governor's personal account. So he had quite an incentive to have his agents looking for these unlawful establishments. Many early tavern keepers here in Adams County were caught operating a tippling house. We have an example right here. This is a tippling indictment that was served to Sarah Black in 1769. Her husband Robert had operated a tavern in areas that would become Mummersburg today. He had passed away, so she was running the tavern, and you can see he's caught and says she is running a tippling house. Tippling indictment could be a serious fine. Usually the people that did it once only did it once. And if you decided you were going to try the court again, you might even wind up going to jail for something like this. But many of the early settlers in this county, many of the early tavern keepers got caught. Sarah Black, John Abbott, Samson Archer, William McClellan, Samuel Geddes, all tavern keepers, all got caught with running a tavern without a license. Now, after the American Revolution, the state governor would still issue the license, but only on the recommendation of the county courts. They finally realized this was kind of silly, so in 1815, the state legislature just transferred the authority from the governor to the county courts themselves. In an age when opportunities for women were limited, being a tavern keeper was considered quite appropriate for women. Indeed, here in Adams County, as we're going to see, many of the widows took over the taverns once their death of their husband, and so we have a lot of the women running a tavern, and it was considered perfectly appropriate. Now, another thing taverns were required to have was a sign. They'd have to have a sign out front, and at night it'd have to be illuminated by lanterns. And here's a sign of the Cross Keys Tavern. These signs were actually pictographs representing the name, such as Cross Keys. But you would have Green Tree, Indian King, the sign of the Eagle, the Washington, things like that. The reason they pretty much did this and kept the names fairly common was many of these people were illiterate. They could not read or write. And so it'd be quite easy if somebody asked, where's the nearest tavern or inn, you could say, go to the sign of the Cross Keys, go to the sign of the Indian King. Also, these names could change if a different proprietor took over the inn or the tavern. Also could change due to political events. For example, in 1776, if your tavern was named the King George, you might want to seriously consider getting another name. Probably the oddest I ever heard was in New York State. After the Battle of Saratoga, General Benedict Arnold, he was recovering from his wound, and he stayed at this tavern, recuperating. Well, after he had left, the tavern keeper had a great idea. He was going to change the name of his tavern to the Benedict Arnold Inn. I'm sure several years later, I hope he kept the sign because he probably had to go right back again. Now, some of these early inns and taverns were also very class conscious. At the top were the establishments that catered to the stagecoach travelers and the wealthy. Next were the inns used by the wagoners and teamsters, those fellows that hauled freight. And lastly were the places used by the drovers. These were men who herded cattle and livestock to market. Any inn that accommodated drovers or wagoners could possibly lose the stage trade. And a lot of times, if drovers and wagoners would stay at a hotel, many a times they had to stay in the bar and sleep on the floor, which probably didn't matter much to them because typically they'd be sleep with, they had their bedrolls and everything. They're probably used to sleeping outside anyway. Now, the stage travelers, they could go upstairs and they might get a bed. If you did get a bed, you might have to share it with 2 or 3 other people. And if they were out of beds, well, you're going to sleep on the floor. Now, depending on the size of the building, women might have to sleep in the same room as the men. By 1800, it was probably more common, though, to have private rooms for the women. But you can understand it's not considered inappropriate because travelers in those days did not undress for bed. The lack of privacy, the need for warmth, the fear of thieves, and the condition of the bedding, many of these people decided to sleep in their clothes. Now, these stagecoach travelers had to keep to the stage owner's schedule, which usually meant you would be leaving at 4 or 5 in the morning, which meant you had just enough time to splash some cold water in your face, hit the privy, get a fast breakfast, and you were on your way. Now, travelers in those days were quick to learn one thing, depending on what class you were: don't drink the water. Wells were usually shallow, and primitive outhouses and privies were nearby, so you had all this runoff, especially from livestock in the yard, and this could cause all kind of problems. The taverns would sell safe drinks. This would be whiskey, rum, brandy, gin, hard cider, strong beer, basically any concoction that was 40 proof, 20% alcohol. Drinking in those days, though, was considered to be good for the health. And by 1800, the annual per capita consumption was 5 gallons. That's 3 times today's standard. So, yep, they loved alcohol. The prices that an owner could charge was set by the court, and they had to be posted. Rum was the most popular type of alcohol at this time. It was cheap, it was readily available. And some of the drinks they served had some weird names. You had Mimbo, that was rum and loaf sugar; grog, part rum, 3 parts water; flip, strong beer with rum or sugar added; punch, this would be rum, water, sugar, and the rinds of juice, lemons, oranges, whatever; sling, gin, water, and sugar. That could be served hot or cold. The local drinks in this era typically, though, were whiskey and hard cider. If you went to cities or the higher end taverns, you probably had a choice of wine or brandy. The growth of taverns in Adams County can be directly linked to the establishment of the public roads. The first public road in the county would be laid out between February and April 1747. This would be known as the Black's Gap York Road. It would enter the county on the future site of Abbottstown, which would be right here. It would then head westward, going through the future site of New Oxford, Hunterstown, Mummersburg, and then through Black's Gap, which at the time of the Civil War would be known as the Cashtown Pass. Later that same year, a second road would be laid out. This would be known as the York-Nichols Gap Road, and would actually split off from the first road and start heading westward through the future sites of Gettysburg, Fairfield, and then around Jack's Mountain, pretty much going into Nichols Gap, which at the time of the Civil War would be known as the Monterey Pass. In 1769, a very important road will come through the area, especially as Gettysburg would be concerned, is the Baltimore-Shippensburg Road. It would come up from the south, cross the both 1747 roads, and then on through up to Shippensburg. When they laid it out, they actually used the tavern, Black's Tavern, and would become Mummersburg, and Samuel Getty's Tavern, and what become Gettysburg, as reference points. So the surveyors actually used 2 taverns to reference this road right here. Now, of course, when we talk about roads in the 1700s, yes, they took the trees down, but many times they left the stumps, the rocks, no grading, no bridges. So these are very primitive roads. And a lot of times As the wagons are wearing ruts on both sides, it was not uncommon to get hung up on these stumps. And if you got hung up on the stump, it was said you were stumped. That's where the phrase stumped comes from. You would then probably have to, run a stage, you'd have to get out, probably to lighten the load. Also, you might, as a passenger, you might be asked to push the stage up hills or over rocks or whatever. And so it could be very trying. There was actually a man, he was on his way to Bedford. He wrote that the stage got hung up. He got out and started walking to the next stop, and he actually beat the stage to the next stop. Now, in dry weather on flat terrain, 15 to 20 miles was considered good. However, in bad weather, the journey could drag out. Now, there's a lady, Margaret Van Horn Dwight, in 1810, said she was traveling from Harrisburg to Bradford, which today would take you maybe 2 hours. It took her 12 days. So give you an idea how the roads could be in those days. Now, in the early 19th century, though, turnpikes are going to be laid out. What's happening is people are migrating westward. The new territories have opened up. So people are heading out to Ohio, Indiana, the old Northwest Territory. And so the old roads couldn't take the traffic. So now turnpikes are being put in. These turnpikes would be called macadamized. That's packed crushed stone. There'd be no stumps, no rocks. They would have been removed. The roads were graded, and they would have bridges over the streams and creeks. Now, this would make travel much faster and more comfortable. An advertisement for a stage running from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh said it would take less than 4 days. So definitely improve, the rate of travel. Now, these new roads would also cause taverns to grow and flourish. Actually, the early 1800s, I would say the first half of the 1800s, was the golden age of taverns here in Adams County, because with these turnpikes being established, little what they called halfway houses would be established, sometimes only a mile or two apart, to serve all the various travelers coming through. However, in the mid-19th century, a new form of transportation enters the scene, the railroads. Once a railroad line is established to your city, or your town, pretty much the stage lines disappear. Also, freight and livestock can be shipped a lot faster and a lot easier with the rail lines, and so you start losing the wagoners and the drovers. So once the railroad goes in, many of these old taverns and inns disappear, and some would, pretty much the ones in the towns would survive. However, the ones along the turnpikes, what they call the halfway houses, they would kind of be disappear. However, many of the old buildings would remain for decades. In tonight's episode, we're going to explore some historic taverns that were here at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. For students of the battle, these names are probably very familiar. Cashtown Inn, Hersheys Tavern, the Black Horse Tavern, Mertz Tavern, and the Swan Inn. The first one we're going to start with is the Cashtown Inn. Peter Mark bought the property in 1804 from Andrew Miller. There is a 1797 date attributed to the house, but that's probably not correct because the tax record in 1798 only shows a log cabin and a log barn on the property, so this structure here was probably built much later. Now, the new turnpike running from Gettysburg to Cashtown will be completed in 1813, and in 1815, Peter Mark will be granted a tavern license. His house will now serve as a tavern inn, and it was known actually at that time as Mark's Tavern or Mark's Stand. Now, at a time in the early part of the 19th century, bartering was a common form of trade, shortage of cash, so they would barter, but not Peter Mark. If you stayed at this inn, you had to have cash on the barrelhead, and he would not accept barter for any goods or services. Now, this practice will eventually be known to travelers and to settlers around the area, and it finally give the surrounding name the name Cashtown. When it came time to put a post office in for this community, everybody said, what should we name our town? Well, the name stuck. It becomes Cashtown. So while some taverns and inns in Pennsylvania are named after, some towns in Pennsylvania are named after taverns or inns, or the tavern keeper, Cashtown gets its name because of the business practices of Peter Mark. Peter Mark will run his inn until 1840, and he'll own it until his death in 1845. Moses Smith will buy the inn from Mark's heirs in 1847, but he will sell it to Henry Mickley in 1854. Henry's son Jacob will run the inn during the Civil War when it was known as Mickley's Hotel. Now, this inn will be actually visited twice by the Confederates during the war. During Jeb Stuart's raid into Pennsylvania in October 1862, Confederate cavalrymen will stop at Mickley's and they'll help themselves to the liquor. And after the war, Jacob Mickley will submit a damage claim stating that his barn has been stripped of everything, plus he lost 200 gallons of liquor in decanters. The following year gets even worse because in July 1863, this inn will be the center of Confederate activity in the Cashtown area. Confederate officers will stay at the hotel, and some accounts have General A.P. Hill using it for his headquarters. General Lee will actually meet Hill in front of the inn on July the 1st to find out what the gunfire is off to the east. And if you remember that iconic scene in the movie Gettysburg, Martin Sheehan playing General Lee comes down the Chambersburg Pike. He's right in front of the inn here. And the inn, if you look at it, the sign says the Cashtown Inn. That's not right. It would have been Mickley's Hotel in 1863. After the war, Jacob Mickley will put in another damage complaint, and he would actually write on that claim that the entire rebel force under General Lee came down the Chambersburg Pike, passing within 20 feet of my barroom door. Mickley will also file for the loss of a horse, a wagon, a steer, 50 chickens, 100 young apple trees, and 480 gallons of whiskey. A lot of students of the Battle of Gettysburg today wonder where was A.P. Hill during the battle. If he had anything to do with all this missing whiskey, I think we know the answer to that. There was an ad in the Star and Sentinel newspaper for October 20th, 1863, describes the inn, and he listed for sale. Apparently, Jacob Mickley had enough dealing with passing Confederates, and in 1864, Daniel Heintzelman will buy the inn, and with his wife Mary, they will run it until 1890. During the 20th century, the inn will undergo various owners. One time actually served as a biker bar, until it's finally restored by the Buckley family in the 1980s. Now today, the old inn still survives. It's on the Chambersburg Pike, or the old Route 30. However, the last year or two, it hasn't been open, so waiting to see what's developing right there. If we head a mile east towards Gettysburg, we will come to our next tavern, and that will be Hersheys Tavern. Thomas Sweeney will build this tavern in 1815, and he would actually write on his application that he wanted to operate a public house for travelers and strangers who required sojourn along the turnpike from Gettysburg to Chambersburg. It's the most flowery reason I ever saw in a license application to get for a tavern. In the mid-1820s, though, Sweeney is having financial problems, and the tavern will be sold at a sheriff sale in 1828 to Frederick Herr. Herr will then apply for a tavern license to operate a public house of entertainment. An article in the Gettysburg Times in 1941 states that Herr was a scoundrel. Apparently, there were two reasons for this. First, he was running the tavern with a certain Mr. Louis, who was making counterfeit coins in the basement. Louis will be charged and convicted in county court, but nothing happens to her. Apparently, he had no knowledge of the activity, or maybe just had a better lawyer. Second, Herr did not accept the Mennonite faith of his family, and by them he was considered an outcast. By the mid-1850s, Herr is having financial problems, and he's looking to sell the tavern. An ad in the Compiler in 1854 lists the tavern for sale. The property consists of the tavern, 2 tenant houses, a bank barn, a blacksmith shop, and 2 orchards. Pretty extensive piece of land there. In 1854, though, would be the last year that Herr would have a license. So from 1856 to 1869, the only tavern in Cumberland Township would be the Black Horse Tavern on the Fairfield Road, which we'll be talking about shortly. During the Battle of Gettysburg, though, the old tavern would be right on the Confederate artillery line on July the 1st. A Union artillery shell would hit the southeast corner of the building on the second floor, destroying much of the outside wall. Herr will file a damage claim in 1871. The U.S. government will grant the money. Unfortunately, Frederick Herr's heirs will receive the money as Frederick dies in 1869. Now, there is little evidence that the tavern served as a field hospital, but it may have been used as a dressing station, as bloodstains could be seen on the upstairs floors as late as 1986, and there were 6 Confederate burials noted on the property. These men they were from the 11th to 26th North Carolina and the 33rd Virginia, part of Harry Heath's division. A visitor to the tavern in July 1863 had a horrible experience, and he would write, "Near us was a brick tavern, and in the tavern a company of soldiers put up after the battle. We used the water from the tavern well, but it got so ugly and smelt so bad we could hardly drink it. The soldiers were sick and we were sick. They thought there were dead frogs in the well, so one day they pumped and pumped to clear it out, and by here comes up a little piece of wrist with a thumb attached. Now they knew what was the matter, and there was a lot of gagging done among them." If you remember, in our first segment, we talked about how travelers did not drink water. They always drank alcoholic drinks. Maybe this is another reason you shouldn't drink water at a tavern. In 1869, the Reynolds family will purchase the tavern and operate it as a hotel for visitors to the battlefield. It will then, for a number of years, become a private residence until 1879, when it is reopened as a tavern. However, in 1987, during a terrific storm, the roof would actually be ripped off, and the west wall on the second floor would actually collapse and fall into the first floor. Luckily, the Wolfe family, rather than demolishing the old tavern, would rebuild it, and it would reopen for business a year later. And today it still serves the community as a fine restaurant and tavern out on Route 30. If we go about 2 miles south of Hersheys Tavern, we'll come to the famous Black Horse Tavern. Now, William McClellan will move into this area in the 1740s, and he will establish his homestead by Marsh Creek. In 1752, he will open a tavern on this site. Apparently, William neglected to get a tavern license, so also in 1752, he will be served a Tipling indictment for operating a legal tavern. Now, it appears he never got a tavern license, so whether he just stopped operating a legal one or he just kept operating the illegal one without getting caught, we don't really know. After his death in 1755, his son William Jr. will inherit the property, and in 1762, he'll open a legal tavern there. He'll run it himself from 1762 to 1767, but then he gets into politics. He will hold various offices in Cumberland Township from 1767 to 1786. He was also a county commissioner from 1786 to 1788. He will run his tavern one last time in 1789, and he passes away in 1796. Now, his son, William III, we're going to have to start assigning numbers here because there's a lot of William McClellans in this family. He will run the tavern from 1802 to 1805. He will lease it to others while he's running other taverns. Now, this McClellan clan was really big into taverns in this area. He would be a proprietor at the Globe in 1806. He will actually buy the Indian Queen on the Diamond from James Scott. In 1810, he's over at the Sign of the Buck on Chambersburg Street. So he's pretty active in tavern keeping and stuff in the area. Apparently, though, this is too much. He will finally actually sell both taverns in Gettysburg in 1812. It was actually William McClellan III, though, who would actually build a stone bridge over Marsh Creek. As you can see in the picture today, you can see the Black Horse Tavern on the other side of the creek, and you can see the stone bridge that William McClellan had built. Also, in 1813, he will build a 2-story stone addition to his tavern, and this is what we see right here. So you can see the stone addition, and to the left is the log tavern that had been there prior to that. And he will run this as the Black Horse Tavern. He will run it from 1813 to 1830, but shortly before his death in 1831, he'll sell it to William McCulloch. Now, the tavern will pass through other owners until 1846, when Francis Bream, the former sheriff of Adams County, buys it. Bream will run the tavern himself until 1874. Now, the Black Horse Tavern will flourish because of its location. Being on the old 1747 road that went through Nichols Gap and onto Hagerstown, the tavern would be an important stop for drovers who are driving large herds of cattle up from Virginia to markets in Pennsylvania. The drovers would pen up their cattle on the 400 acres of Bream's farm, and they would stay in the tavern. In the 1840s, the local militia units would drill on the farm, and Bream himself would also hold horse races and other equestrian competitions. Very well known and very popular. People as far away as Maryland and Virginia would actually come to participate in those events. And actually, from 1856 to 1869, Bream will only have the only tavern license in Cumberland Township. Now, during the battle, the area around the tavern would be occupied by Confederates. On the night of July the 1st, General Andrew Humphreys, commander of the 2nd Division of the Union 3rd Corps, will stop at the tavern trying to find out where the Union Army was. He had taken a wrong turn when he crossed Marsh Creek, and he gets up to the tavern and he meets with Bream. And Bream will tell him that the Union Army has retreated south of town, and now he's actually behind the Confederate lines. Now, nobody knows exactly, what was said or what the conversation was about, but Humphreys later wrote that he suspected that Bream had Southern sympathies. On July the 2nd, during Longstreet's march south, they will actually pass the tavern. Of course, just south of the tavern, they will go up onto Bream's Hill. And from that hill, they notice the Union signal station on Little Round Top. So while the column is stopped, while General Longstreet and his staff are trying to figure out what to do, a member of Longstreet's staff, Colonel John Black, found out there were barrels of whiskey in the tavern, and not wanting any of the men to imbibe, he would actually have those barrels of whiskey destroyed. When Black mentioned this to Longstreet, the general said, "I suppose you saved some for yourself and me." Black was a teetotaler, and he said, "Excuse me, General, as I do not drink, I forgot to do so." This probably did not help General Longstreet's disposition that afternoon. Later on July the 2nd, a Confederate field hospital would be set up at the tavern for McLaw's division, and 23-year-old Dr. Simon Baruch, the father of Bernard Baruch, would set up a field hospital there. He pretty much attached to the 3rd South Carolina Battalion of Kershaw's brigade. They had just gotten everything set up when the wounded from Kershaw's brigade start arriving, and Dr. Baruch will work from the afternoon of July the 2nd straight through to the afternoon of July the 3rd, pretty much 24 continuous hours. On the early morning of the 4th, the slightly wounded will be moved out, and only those unable to travel will remain. General Lee will order Doctors Baruch, Pierce, and Knott to remain with 10 orderlies to attend the 222 wounded Confederates who were at the tavern. 70 Confederates will actually be buried on the tavern grounds, including Colonel William de Saussure of the 15th South Carolina Infantry. He will actually initially be buried in the Bream family burial ground. Also, there would be Captain Fitzgerald Ross, an observer from the Austrian Army, and he would write how the front yard of the tavern was a regular rendezvous for the Confederate generals during the retreat, and how he met General Jeb Stuart there. After the war, Bream will file a damage claim for $7,000, but he will receive nothing, as the damage was done by the Confederate Army. Bream will die in 1884, and his son Robert will own the building until 1923, but it had long ceased being used as a tavern, and today the building is a private residence along the Fairfield Road. What we're going to do now is head south down the Emmitsburg Road, and our next tavern will be Mertz's Tavern. In 1802, Matthias Waybright will obtain a license to open a tavern along the new road between Gettysburg and Emmitsburg. This road opened in 1801. Waybright was quick to take advantage of this new business opportunity. In 1811, Waybright will sell the tavern, the outbuildings, and 24 acres of land to Nicholas Mertz. Now, that's pronounced, I know it looks like Moritz, but it's pronounced Mertz. And he will actually write on his license application that he is a stand lately occupied by M. Waybright. And he will actually run his tavern until 1861. In 1862, Nicholas's son Samuel will take over the tavern, and on March the 3rd, 1863, Nicholas Mertz will pass away. Now, for whatever reason, Samuel Mertz did not renew his license in 1863. So at the time of the battle, this was not an operating tavern. On June the 30th, 1863, the old tavern will become the headquarters for General John Reynolds, commander of the left wing of the Army of the Potomac. Reynolds will have dinner that night at the tavern with General Howard, commander of the Union 11th Corps. And there are stories that Reynolds' aides had to bring food in from nearby surrounding farmsteads. Well, maybe because it was not an operating tavern at the time, they didn't have enough food on hand to handle guests like this. Also, it said that Reynolds spent the night at the tavern sleeping on some chairs. However, according to the Mertz family tradition, he actually slept on a bench. And actually, that bench was in possession of the Mertz family for many decades afterwards. Of course, when one of General Reynolds' aides came in, he was returning from 20town that morning, he found the general sleeping on the floor. So maybe he tried the chairs, went to the bench, and finally went to the most comfortable location. In 1864, Samuel Mertz will renew his license, and he will run the tavern here until 1875. In 1876, Samuel will partner with Joseph Johnson, and then they will run a store there for the next 10 years. Samuel's younger brother, John Mertz, served in Company C of Cole's Cavalry. On December the 7th, 1871, Company C will have a reunion at the tavern. In 1886, the building will be used by the Mertz family as their residence. And when Samuel dies in 1915, half of the tavern will be inherited by John Gieselman, his adopted son, and it will stay in the family. When Samuel's daughter Catherine dies in 1852, the old tavern will be sold. This tavern had been in the Mertz family for 141 years. The old tavern still stands today as a private residence, but with the new Route 15 behind it and commercial businesses on both sides, it's hard to picture how it looked in its heyday. For our last tavern on this segment, we'll actually go back to into the town of Gettysburg and talk about the Swan Inn. Now, Jacob Stock, a native of Bavaria, would open the Swan Inn on South Washington Street in 1862. This is right near where the hospital is today. Stock had immigrated to the United States in 1846, and in the 1860 census, he was actually listed as a coachmaker. I guess he wanted to maybe a little easier profession, so in 1862, he applied for a tavern license, and he would run the Swan until 1869. Now, Stock was an avid hunter and an excellent shot, and what he wanted to do is have shooting competition in his bar. Well, the idea of firing off a musket with the noise and the smoke would be a little much, so he actually had air rifles that would kind of fire almost like these flechette darts. And actually, the Adams County Historical Society has two of Stock's air rifles. Hopefully one day they'll be put back on display again. Now, during the battle, the Confederates will actually use the Swan as a sniper position. It's on the south end of town. It's got a perfect view of Cemetery Hill, so the snipers in this building were harassing Union soldiers on Cemetery Hill, especially the 73rd Ohio. It finally got to the point where the Union ships, I guess they had enough, so they put a 12-pound Napoleon on the 20-town road, and they opened up with artillery. Now, after the war, Stock would file a damage claim for $653. He said he lost his bedstand, his dresser had been destroyed. Of course, today, if you look at it, you can still see the pockmarks in the south wall, and I was always wondering, how did he lose a bedstand and a dresser? And then I found this picture taken right after the battle. So now you could see the damage caused by that artillery, and you can understand why he probably lost his dresser and bedstand. So on top, you see right after the battle, and today, pretty much how it looks today. So there's still a lot of dings in the bricks and everything, but nothing how it looked in 1863. Out of that damage claim for $653, Stock actually was awarded $153 because it was the Union Army that did the damage. In 1870, Stock will leave the Swan and he will open a new hotel on the southwest corner of Washington High Street, and so the old Swan would now become a private residence. However, of the 6 taverns that were in operation in Gettysburg in 1863, this is the only building still standing in town today. Well, that includes our program for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If there's further interest, what we can do is explore other taverns. We didn't cover, there's a lot of taverns that were here during the Civil War we did not cover tonight. We mainly did these because these buildings are still standing today. You can see them, and they were pretty famous taverns in 1863. Further episodes could be following John Gordon's march across Adams County. We could do the taverns from, the Franklin Adams County line right into the borough. We could do a program, another segment on the taverns in the town of Gettysburg in 1863. And also we could follow John Gordon on his march on June the 27th, the taverns he would see in New Oxford, Abbottstown, like that. So I hope you enjoyed the program. See you again next time.
Thank you very much, John, for that unusual perspective on Adams County history. I hope you will drop us a line if you'd like to learn more about the Adams County Taverns, which John has a rich catalog of information to share with us. And if you'd like to continue our programs, I hope you will consider hitting the donate button, and any amount will be much appreciated by the Adams County Historical Society. Thank you for joining us.